including 5 straight at the NCAA tournament. His total world had shrunk to the 12 by 12 dimensions of a wrestling mat.
I can visualize him walking back and forth with his head down. His eyes would get glassy, and you really couldn't even talk to him. In fact, you wouldn't even try because he wouldn't answer you.
Not very many people have the ability to push themselves beyond when they start to hurt, to the point where I've seen him actually crying, being carried out of the restroom.
I saw many times that he'd get somebody he knew he could pin right away, but he wouldn't do it. I really believe that he avoided pinning him so that he could just keep going and make the match last longer.
He was wrestling a wrestler from Colorado by the name of Connor Metcalf, and he came into the match in Iowa State at Ames at the old Armory, I think 16-0. And I remember a journalist had asked Metcalf, is there any way Gable can pin you? And he says, he may beat me, but there's no way Dan Gable can pin me. Dan was ahead like 10 or 11 to 1 or 2, and Dan just forced him to his back and pinned him. And I remember the Colorado team walked out onto the mat to help Metcalf get off the mat, and Gable was just sitting there. And I remember the coach and the athletes were staring at Gable like, who are you? Where'd you come from?
All of a sudden, he's the closest thing to a superstar that's ever been in wrestling. He wasn't a great interview or anything. You just had this great single-mindedness that people admired.
He was able to concentrate on one area. Wrestling was all he cared about.
He literally ran the class every day, and he always had ankle weights on his ankles, and he always had a rope in his hand, and he'd sit in class and he'd do isometrics during class. And he didn't just do that once. I mean, that's the way he was.
I went to a movie with him once or twice, and he'd usually leave because he wanted to go work out. You're sitting there engrossed in the movie, and all of a sudden Dan will hit you and say, I gotta go.
There was a point in his life where I would have, if somebody were to ask me about Dan, I'd say he's socially retarded. He didn't have a social life.
He was so shy, he wouldn't talk to any girls, and we would always get him on campus, and we would run up and start telling everybody, you know, this is Dan Gable. You guys, you know, he's the most famous wrestler, and he would literally run away and hide.
Finally, in my senior year in college, I actually took a gal out, and I looked at my clock when I got home. It was like 3 a.m., and I had a running practice lined up at 7. And I didn't feel good at that running practice. I was tired all day. That just solidified my mind that it wasn't going to work. And something had to give.
What Gable understood about wrestling is that it's the cruelest mistress in the world. It required all your attention, all your time, all your focus.
Sometimes people who are focused, people say, gee, that person ought to get a life. But his life and his dedication was wrestling.
I don't think Dan Gable physically should have ever accomplished what he did. He made himself into probably the greatest wrestler this country has ever had.
Gable rose to wrestling preeminence by means of a commitment forged in the fires of tragedy.
With the new Geico Glove Box.
Waterloo, Iowa is not for the faint of heart. Dominated by a factory that makes the John Deere tractor, the blue-collar town stands in bold contrast to the rolling farmland its product serves. Tough, industrial, at times confrontational, it spawned a champion, Dan Gable.
A lot of the athletes were from tough families and backgrounds. It's different than what people think of when they think of Iowa. It's more like a city.
Critics of Waterloo would say it's a Joe Sixpack town.
There was a lot of drinking families, and I would say it developed, for the most part, hardcore, hard-living people.
Born in October of 1948, Dan Gable was the younger of 2 children of Mac, who sold real estate, and Katie, who reared her children by a severe code of behavior.
Katie probably was the hard one of the bunch, and if we weren't doing things that she thought was right, she'd call us molly puts, wimps.
When I actually lost a match, I was not responding well, and my mom basically read me the riot act, told me to put my ballet slippers on.
He loved his folks. The fact remains that it was a household where abuse happened. Police were called to the house once because Mac was hitting kids. Mac drank too much. Mac drank a lot.
I don't think our family would have had any difficulties if it wasn't carried away with drinking. If my parents were out, if they were not home when they were supposed to be, I was always be at the front room window, waiting for them to come home, thinking maybe something happened to them.
We were over there shooting pool one time, and Mac came home and he had been drinking. And there was a kid named Mike Graham there, and Dan introduced him, and Mike put his hand out, and Mac did an arm drag on him, took him right down on the floor. Well, embarrassed the heck out of Dan.
To escape his dysfunctional home life, Gable often withdrew into daydreams.
He had an older sister who had her own life, basically, and he learned, as kind of an only child would, I think, to make up games for himself.
I would do shadow boxing, shadow wrestling, shadow swimming, shadow baseball playing, just by myself for hours. I'd never lose any of those things. Never lost once.
He would listen to these games, and they'd give him a mental playground that would serve him well as a kid, and that would help him to realize things beyond Easley Street in Waterloo, Iowa.
I was kind of mischievous, and I think I could have been the bad guy. I'm in the back seat of a car, and I'm eating an ice cream cone, and my dad says something that made me mad, so he was wearing the ice cream cone after that. If I was a little kid, I'd walk in his room, and I'd want to destroy this place.
As a teenager, Gable found his lifelong passion in the sport favored by his father. He so loved its Spartan demands that he asked the wrestling coach for the key to the Waterloo West High School training room.
He was so intense about wanting to get going, and I couldn't say no.
Coach Siddons would tell us, if you're walking down the hall and see another wrestler, he said, you can fake like you're making a move. And Danny would try that. He'd always be like he was trying to make a move with somebody.
We were watching West High School in the first round of the 1964 state basketball tournament, and we were sitting in his living room, and he was over grunting and groaning, doing push-ups. Someone says, Gable, what in the hell are you doing? He said, I got to get ready for next year.
Gable's dedication paid an early dividend. As a sophomore, he was undefeated on the mat, taking the 95-pound state title in March of 1964. Then, just 2 months later, the Gables' pride in their son's success was buried under the crushing weight of the darkest of human events.